Do they call this fate? My heart skipped a beat as I heard the term fate. Grace gave a little laugh. Maybe it's odd to hear that from a tall woman like me, she replied. Then she got up and walked away with Grace. If you were my destined partner, nothing would make me happier. As Grace skillfully fixed her kimono, I couldn't help but stare at her blankly. I'm 30 years old, and my name is Henry. The historic Hot Spring Inn where I work has been around for 130 years. Am I in charge of cleaning, serving food, front desk, guest services, or housekeeping? Everything is done by me, with the exception of cooking. Being the youngest member of the team, I frequently get assigned to odd jobs and physical labor. Only 2 groups of guests today, huh? I was going to sigh as I looked at the guest ledger at the front desk when I heard a somber voice behind me. Just 2 groups today, huh? A stunning woman wearing a kimono was standing there when I turned around. It was this inn's youthful proprietress, Grace. Her somewhat big lips and fascinating eyes were exactly what I liked. However, she was 3 years older than me and towered over my 165 centimeters frame at 173 centimeters. It was difficult to believe that she ever considered me as a potential love interest. We will fail at this rate, she whispered. I wonder if there's a way out of this. I took one look out the window. Even though it was far away, its sheer size was intimidating. Since it first opened, that enormous resort hotel had put our historic inn through a difficult period. People had been drawn away from this quaint old hot spring village by the imposing structure that had suddenly appeared in the center of it. Attracted by the resort's opulence, guests completely avoid our inn and make their way there instead. Sensing the danger, other local inns had enlarged or refurbished to keep their customers. But our inn missed that shift, or rather, we deliberately decided not to follow it. Built 130 years ago, this inn was still standing precisely as it had been. The mansion has withstood the devastation of war and has been meticulously maintained without any changes. I prefer not to make any changes to this beautifully preserved historic home, I replied. Sophia, the proprietress, and Tyler, her husband, were determined to maintain it that way. It was more than simply stubbornness, of course. Even I thought that making any changes to this place would be a shame. The massive timber beams had gracefully weathered over more than 130 years. The black, polished pillars were dignified. The plaster walls, which naturally controlled humidity, were warm but practical. The lobby ceiling was my favorite feature. The big pine logs that served as rafters were stunning. But it wasn't without problems. Because of this, winters are frigid and insects can occasionally slink through tiny openings. Although we have been patching cracks and performing small repairs, old homes are inherently cold and drafty. We can never fully address it, no matter how hard we try. However, I think the charm is enhanced by taking a bath in a hot spring in such circumstances. It is the greatest. I can't dispute reviews that claim it's overly chilly and outdated, though. I wish more people could realize the advantages of this vintage appeal. Grace's melancholic expression stirred a strong desire in me to help somehow. Then, an idea suddenly popped into my head. How about kimonos? I suggested. Grace blinked, surprised. Kimonos? I nodded. My grandmother left me a large collection of kimonos. You know how some places let guests choose their favorite yukata? What if we did something similar, but lent out kimonos? That could help us stand out. This little hot spring town already has a nostalgic atmosphere. I've always thought it would be beautiful to see couples strolling around in kimonos. Kimonos would also look stunning inside this inn. Grace's eyes widened. That sounds wonderful. Her face lit up, and I felt my cheeks heat up a little. Oh, but those kimonos are precious keepsakes from your grandmother. Are you sure? She asked, her glowing expression clouded with concern. I forced a reassuring smile. Of course. Actually, I've been airing them out at my parents' house regularly, and honestly, it's a lot of work. If they could be put to good use, I'd be relieved. And I think my grandmother would be thrilled too. My grandmother had adored kimonos. She came from a wealthy family and had received a number of kimonos as her wedding gifts. Even after marrying my grandfather, she saved up her allowance to buy more, little by little. Friends who knew of her love for kimonos would often pass along ones they no longer needed. As a result, she ended up with a massive collection. After her passing, we didn't know what to do with them. Selling off her beloved kimonos didn't feel right, and it's not like I could wear them myself. The kimonos had been relegated to the back of my mind, only to resurface during the seasonal airing. But seeing Grace's worried face brought them back to the forefront. After consulting with Sophia, we decided to make use of the kimonos. I and a coworker drove to my family home in a large car to pick them up. You've been waiting for this moment, haven't you? I decided to speak to my grandmother's keepsakes. Somehow, they seemed to gleam a little brighter. We brought the kimonos into the large banquet hall, spread them out, and inspected them one by one. Grace let out a surprised gasp as she looked at one of them. Wait, is this? It was an elaborate formal kimono, primarily pink with a scattering of small floral patterns. Oddly, the fabric beneath the hidden overlay tuck was patched with a completely different material. That one might not be suitable for casual lending. The added fabric and its extravagance might make guests uneasy, I explained. Before I could finish, Grace dashed off. I stood there, dumbfounded, as she hurried back just moments later. And then this, she exclaimed, thrusting a photo in front of me. It was a photo of a tall girl smiling in front of a small guest house, dressed in a traditional kimono. The kimono she wore was the very same formal attire I saw before me now. The location in the background. My eyes widened. I went on a trip with my mother just once, Grace said wistfully as she gazed at the photo. Travel was a rare luxury during her childhood as the families kept them busy. But once her father, Tyler, had arranged for a short overnight trip for Grace and Sophia out of consideration for Tyler. They had chosen a simple trip, staying at a small seaside guest house and enjoying fresh seafood. That little guest house was my family's home, or to be precise, the one run by my grandparents. I lost my parents in a car accident when I was young, and since then, my grandparents had raised me in that guest house. On the front desk of the guest house, there was an amusing sign. Would you like to try wearing a kimono in our little fishing town where old rust-stained houses stood scattered and fishing boats were moored in the harbor? Kimonos seemed entirely out of place. It was a peculiar service for such a town, yet surprisingly many people expressed interest in trying it. It wasn't a main attraction or anything fancy. It was simply a casual offer for guests who noticed the sign and asked to wear it. Many never even realized it was an option. From the many kimonos my grandmother owned, she would let guests choose one to wear. Since it was too much work to lay them all out, guests would select from photographs instead. Grace had been captivated by a sparkling formal kimono adorned with scattered floral patterns. Seeing her excitement, my grandmother narrowed her eyes in delight and tried to let her wear it. But even back then, Grace had just started middle school and already stood 170 centimeters tall. The kimono wasn't long enough. I was so disappointed that day, Grace remembered, her brows furrowing slightly as she spoke. The kimonos worn by the proprietors of the inn were always plain and embellished. Having only seen such simple garments, Grace had been enchanted by the dazzling formal kimono and had been eager to wear it, only to have her hopes dashed. In the end, the only kimono from my grandmother's collection that fit Grace's height was a plain blue one. She went back to her room feeling a little sad, never getting to wear the formal kimono. Even so, the meal had been exceptionally delicious, the bath incredibly relaxing, and she thoroughly enjoyed the rare trip despite her disappointment. The next morning, as Grace and her mother, Sophia, were eating breakfast before checking out, my grandmother quietly sat down beside them. Then she handed over the formal kimono. This should work for you now, she said. When Grace unfolded the kimono, she noticed that the central section had been patched with an entirely different fabric. This part will be hidden under the sash, my grandmother said with a smile. I'm not a professional seamstress, so it's not perfect, but as long as it's hidden, I hope you don't mind. My grandmother had extended the kimono so that Grace, with her tall frame, could wear it. She had cut the hidden section of fabric and stitched in an extension. Even though it was a makeshift solution, it must have taken considerable time. Yet, my grandmother didn't show a hint of tiredness, instead beaming at Grace. Grace delayed their checkout to wear the formal kimono, and she took a photograph with her mother, Sophia. Even now, the memory of that day warmed her heart. When Grace finished her story, I spoke up. Now that you mention it, I once asked my grandmother why that kimono had a patch. She said it was for tall guests. I never imagined it was because of you. As a little boy, freely wandering around the inn, I might have even met Grace back then, but I had no memory of her at that time. I would have been in the 4th grade, a mischievous boy playing along the shoreline every day. Speaking of which, that day, your grandmother gave me a small seashell, saying, "My grandson collected this." Could that have been you? She smiled softly, and I turned bright red. I never knew the random seashells I picked up on the beach were being given to guests. It's funny how we were connected in such unexpected ways. Still blushing, I muttered, staring down at the floor. Grace exhaled softly. Is this what they call fate? The word fate made my heart race. Grace in my face grew even hotter. I couldn't bring myself to look up. Grace chuckled gently. Maybe it's odd to hear that from a tall woman like me. With that, she stood up gracefully and went to check the other kimonos. If Grace really is my destined partner, nothing could make me happier, I thought, watching Grace gracefully handle the kimono. Her movements were mesmerizing as my thoughts wandered. In the end, I did not take over my grandparents' guest house, which was a place of memories for Grace. When my grandfather passed away suddenly, and my grandmother followed during my college years, I couldn't envision myself taking over the inn. Looking back now, I wonder if my decision to leave my corporate job after college and join this traditional inn was fueled, at least in part, by a lingering admiration for the hospitality industry. New services don't mean much unless people know about them. We added the Kimono Experience service to the inn's official website and booking platforms. We also launched official social media accounts and began promoting the service with photos. The formal kimono Grace wore in particular garnered a lot of attention and positive reactions. Then, a few days later, when I arrived at work, the inn was in chaos. The phones wouldn't stop ringing. One of my coworkers, phone in hand, stammered out, "Sorry, I don't know," in a mix of English and heavily accented Japanese. I had to stifle a laugh. Spotting me, Grace looked over with a furrowed brow. "Oh, Henry, it's incredible. Thanks to the social media post, we're getting so many inquiries from international guests. But aside from Grace and Sophia, who could manage basic English, no one else spoke any foreign languages. Even Grace and Sophia struggled when the conversations grew more complicated. On top of that, some of the languages were completely unfamiliar. Do you know of any good translation apps?" Grace was asking when another call came in. I answered the phone. The language was French. I hesitated for a moment, but responded in French. I could feel everyone around me holding their breath. It was an inquiry about the photos on social media. The question was whether they could wear the kimono Grace had worn, so I asked about their height and assured them it would fit. Their delighted response and promise to visit ended the call, only for the phone to ring again immediately. This time, the caller was American. Switching to English, I resumed responding. It was a question about pricing, so I checked with Grace and Sophia and informed them that it would be free for the time being. The calls kept coming in: Chinese, Korean, German. When one was in Arabic, I apologized and asked if English was okay, which they graciously accepted. Posting on social media that we were working on a queue and a page and asking people to hold their inquiries helped stem the flood of calls. I posted answers to the questions I'd been asked so far, all in English for now. That day, I spent the entire time dealing with social media responses and didn't do any of my usual duties as an inn attendant. I spent the rest of the day creating a FAQ page in multiple languages, compiling answers to the most common questions we received. When I let out a sigh, Grace brought me a cup of tea. It was the roasted green tea served at the inn and my favorite. I couldn't help but smile. "Thank you. It's delicious, just what I needed," I said as I let out a deeply relaxed sigh. Grace gave me a puzzled look and said, "The one who should be saying thank you is me. I didn't know you could speak so many languages. That wasn't on your resume, was it, Henry? Who exactly are you?" I scratched my head awkwardly in response. "It's nothing special." I started to tell her my story. After losing my parents in an accident, I was raised by my grandparents at their guest house. But when I was in 5th grade, my grandfather passed away suddenly. It hadn't even been a year since Grace's visit when my grandmother decided to close the guest house without hesitation. The management of the guest house was almost entirely handled by my grandfather. In particular, the fish used in the highly praised dishes were freshly caught by my grandfather himself, something my grandmother could never have managed to procure, though his fishing buddies offered to help. My grandmother knew she couldn't replicate his cooking and decided it was best to close the guest house. Grandfather had often joked, "If Henry wants to take over someday, he can." But as a 5th grader, I hadn't given any thought to the future. We left the building as it was, thinking that if I ever wanted to reopen it someday, it would still be an option. Though his sudden passing was heartbreaking, the life insurance from my parents' accident and my grandfather's own policy ensured we weren't left in immediate financial trouble. At that moment, my grandmother had a brilliant idea. "It's an international world now," she declared and started hosting homestay guests in the unused rooms of our guest house. What I thought would be a quiet life with just the two of us turned into a lively, bustling home filled with foreign visitors coming and going. My grandmother would serve delicious Japanese home-cooked meals to the homestay guests, and in return, she asked them to teach me their languages. Although their stays were short, the constant rotation of visitors meant I was exposed to a variety of languages and cultures. As a teenager, I thought it was just an unnecessary hassle. With school getting harder, I couldn't understand why I had to study French or Korean when I wasn't required to. I often complained loudly about how pointless it all seemed, but my grandmother always responded with the same words. "It's an international world now." My protests fell on deaf ears, and yet here I am now, able to help Grace and this inn. It turned out to have meaning after all, didn't it? I finished my story and took a sip of the roasted green tea. Grace's eyes went wide. "That's amazing. You learned to speak so well just from the homestay guests teaching you." I tilted my head slightly. "Well, maybe. They all said I had a good ear for it. Every foreigner who taught me a language praised me for having a good ear. I would listen to the words they spoke, remember them, and repeat them as they were. I could remember and replicate anything I heard just once. Looking back, even in my childhood, I could memorize and sing anything, whether it was a song or something else, after hearing it just once. Since I wasn't particularly good at singing, it never occurred to me that this could be considered a special talent. That's not just a skill, it's like a superpower." Grace widened her eyes in surprise as she spoke, but I couldn't quite grasp what she meant. "I'm not so sure. I've never been confident about it. The homestay guests were all kind and always said excellent, even though my language skills were clumsy. They were just being nice, I think. Because of that, I never truly believed my words were understood. That's why I'd never claimed to speak foreign languages, and likely never would. Most of the guests at this inn were Japanese, and even when foreign visitors came, Grace's English was enough to handle things, so I never really had a role to play. But Grace shook her head firmly. If you can handle phone calls, then you're fine. For me, I can get by in English face-to-face with gestures, but phone calls are much harder. Not being able to see the other person's face, it's unnerving. She had a point. I couldn't tell from their expression whether they understood or not. Even when someone said, "Okay," it was hard to tell if they really understood. At this rate, we're going to see more foreign guests. There will probably be situations where I can't handle it alone. Grace turned to me, straightening her posture. I'm counting on you. Don't quit, okay? She bowed gracefully. I panicked. Wait, please don't. I'm not that special. Grace lifted her head. Not that special. You're amazing. Have some confidence. Her sharp gaze flustered me even more. Maybe I showed a little bit of a cool side today, I muttered, scratching my head awkwardly. Grace smiled gently. Henry, you're always cool. Her words made my face burn bright red. You're always the first to take the lead, she said. The senior attendants are getting older, and tasks that strain their backs or knees, you always take care of those for them. Everyone appreciates how thoughtful you are. That's what makes you so cool. I felt utterly embarrassed. I guess it's just because I grew up with my grandparents and got used to it. Grace's smile deepened. Well, if your grandmother raised you, it's no wonder you turned out to be kind and cool. I've always admired her. She must have stayed up late to extend the kimono for me just because I looked so sad. I think she's amazing, and she's still my role model. I want to become a proprietress like her, someone who can naturally empathize with others. As she spoke, Grace opened her palm in front of me. In her hand was a small bottle filled with sand and a tiny pink seashell. Grace chuckled softly. I love that little shell so much that my mom and I bought this small bottle at a souvenir shop, filled it with sand, and put the shell inside. It's been nearly 20 years, but it's still beautiful, isn't it? The shell I had picked up from the beach 20 years ago now shone brightly in Grace's hands. Looking at it, I felt as if my grandmother were cheering me on. Grace, I love you. Grace's eyes whitened at my sudden confession. It's fine. I understand. I know I'm not even on your radar. I'm younger than you, shorter than you, and completely unreliable. But just like that little shell, I'd like to stay by your side. I want to be the one who supports you the most. That's why I'll never leave. Grace's lips trembled. So, are you confessing to me or rejecting me? Her words confused me, and I tilted my head. But isn't it normal? Don't most men dislike women who are taller and older than them? Grace bit her lip tightly, and I panicked. What? Don't women dislike younger men who are shorter than them? Still looking down, Grace shook her head slowly. I don't dislike it. Tears welled up in my eyes. Is it really okay? Because I'm serious. Ever since I found out you once stayed at my grandparents' guest house, I've been thinking, what if you're truly my destined partner? Could you really choose me? Grace lifted her face. I've been thinking the same thing, but I'm tall and older, and I always thought someone small, cute, and sweet would suit someone as kind and young as you. And then I learned you could speak so many languages. You're like a superhero. Are you sure I'm the one you want? I pulled Grace into an embrace. You're overestimating me. I'm just a guy who drank way too much milk trying to grow taller and still failed. You deserve someone taller, older, and more refined. Before I could finish, Grace smacked my back. Are you rejecting me? Her voice from within my arms made me tighten my embrace. There's no way I'd let this be a misunderstanding. Now that it's come to this, I'll never let you go. Grace whispered softly from within my hold, and I'll never give you up to some tiny, cute girl. Her words made me smile. I lifted my head slightly and kissed her on the cheek. She blushed deeply but smiled back at me. Several years later, Grace and I got married. Her parents retired, and Grace officially became the proprietor of the inn. I'm still handling a wide variety of tasks, and I don't have the dignity or presence to be called things like president, master, or boss. Even so, everyone treats me with respect, and I'm grateful. The kimono rental service thrived. It wasn't just foreign visitors. Japanese women also enjoyed renting kimonos to stroll around the town. When we put out a call for kimono donations to expand the variety, we received a generous response. Some of the kimonos were for children, which made them popular with families. Another hit was the option to take photos inside the inn. Guests took photos at various spots, such as with the lustrous black central pillar or from the second-floor space alongside the stately beams. The unique charm of this historic home is beautifully captured in these photos, which then circulate online, catching the eyes of new visitors and inspiring them to come. This positive cycle made both Grace and me smile. The small hot spring town embraced its identity as a town where kimonos shine, adding traditional decorations throughout. We collaborated with other inns in the area, allowing guests from any inn to rent kimonos from us at a discount. Of course, for guests staying at our inn, it remained free. We also did a bit of remodeling to highlight the beauty of the beams for photography. We removed some walls on the second floor and added a railing and space for better views. We installed underfloor heating in the cold hallways so guests wouldn't feel chilled after a warm soak in the baths. The renovations were minimal, but well received by our guests. After the outdoor bath closes, the staff takes a short rest. The guests retire to their rooms or enjoy their evenings as they please, and our children drift into their dreams. Late at night, we set up a baby monitor in the children's bedroom, and once a week, Grace and I share a drink together. Sometimes in the lobby, sometimes in the garden, and sometimes in front of the grand central pillar. Spending time enjoying a quiet drink with Grace at our favorite spots in the inn is our irreplaceable moment of relaxation. To think there were days when this inn had no guests. It feels like a dream now. Grace smiles softly as she brings the sake cup to her lips. Her movements were so graceful, so elegant. Even after all these years, I couldn't help but be captivated. It all started with Grandma's kimono, but everything since then, it's thanks to you, Grace. We'd highlighted Grace with her tall and elegant figure in our PR efforts. She was especially well received by tall foreign women as the hostess of the inn. Grace's gracious hospitality toward every guest who stays with us is nearly flawless. It's hard to find any faults in her conduct. Grace smiles softly and tilts her head slightly. That's thanks to Harry, giving it his all to support me, isn't it? Her words warmed me deeply. I downed the sake in the small cup in one go. Smile, I'll always give you my all. I held up the empty sake cup in front of Grace. She let out a soft chuckle and said, I'm counting on you, dear, as she handed me the sake-filled cup. As she filled my cup, I let the happiness of the moment sink in. Everything we had now was built on the foundation of countless acts of kindness. It began with my grandmother's kindness toward Grace, the kindness of people from across the country who donated their kimonos to us, the kindness of guests who wore the rented kimonos with care and respect, the kindness of this town's residents who came together to revitalize our little hot spring community, the kindness of Grace's parents who wholeheartedly supported the kimono rental venture, and the kindness of our staff who never abandoned the inn and gave their all to keep it alive. All these threads of kindness had been woven together, and now it was our mission to pass them down to our children and their children. From the baby monitor, we could hear the gentle sound of our children's peaceful breathing, a reminder of the love and care we were privileged to give. For now, my goal was simple: to pour boundless love into these children and nurture the kindness that they would one day pass on. I rested my head on Grace's shoulder and tilted the sake cup.